right. Well, good evening. Welcome everybody who is joining us today for this joint event by Capitol Hill Village and Hill Havura. Thank you, Sig Cohen, for helping us organize this event. And a very big thanks to Professor Kristin Henning. And Sig, over to you.
I'd just like to, on behalf of the Hill Havura, welcome everyone to this event, which I've been looking forward to for a long time. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Kristin Henning, who's a Bloom Professor of Law at Georgetown University and also the director of the Juvenile Justice Law Clinic and Initiative. I don't know how many of you have heard about her book, The Rage of Innocence, but among many topics, her book looks at adolescent psychology, the racial disparity in responses to teenage behavior, and the trauma of over-policing that creates among Black youth in our country. This book has helped me better understand and become aware of the stress and anxiety that many Black children live with every single day. I might have been aware of it intellectually, but this book, particularly with the stories that I'm sure that Professor Henning will relate, but these stories really go to the heart of the issue. Professor Henning has spent 26 years with the DC Public Defender Service defending Black youth. I think she said, I noted that out of God knows how many cases, only 4 of your defendants were white. Goodness knows how many were Black. She's a recognized authority in this area. She's traveled throughout the country, conducts workshops on helping people understand their own racial biases and develop strategies to deal with it. She's a consultant to a number of states as well as the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. She's a graduate of Duke University with a law degree from Yale and a master's of law, Georgetown Law School. That's enough from me. Professor Henning, welcome. You take it from here.
All right. Thank you all so much for this introduction and for the invitation, I should say. And thank you, Sig, for the invitation. And Sig and I have been in contact for quite a while about these issues. I love your passion and your commitment to these topics and your interest in learning about them. So I am very, very happy to be in this space with you. I am going to share my screen. And I'll talk for a bit, and then I really want to open it for Q&A so that I can hear from you and what you all would want to know more about. So let me say, I want to start exactly where Sig took us in the introduction, which is indeed, I am currently the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law School. And in that capacity, and I should say before that, as Sig said, I was an attorney with the DC Public Defender Service. In total, I have been representing children in the nation's capital for 26 years. But what is so shocking and what really resonated with Sig is exactly the fact that I have only represented 4 white children in 26 years. Every other child that I have represented in our local court system has been an African-American child. That should cause every single one of us listening to gasp in shock. Those of you who live in the District of Columbia, who are familiar with the District of Columbia, know that there are plenty of white children in our city, and that children, teenagers of all races and classes engage in sort of these impulsive and delinquent behaviors that I will talk about. But it's really hard to do this work for as long as I have, for 26 years, and not want to ask the really hard questions, right? The easiest of the hard questions is, I wanted to know if these racial disparities are evident all over the country. I also wanted to know why these extreme racial disparities exist. I also wanted to know how these disparities are impacting Black youth mentally, physically, psychologically, developmentally. And that's one of the things that Sig said has resonated in reading the book and in hearing me in previous conversations. So I will share that with you all. And then I also really wanted to know if this sort of criminalization of Black adolescents is as harmful as I thought it was, then what can we do about it? So indeed, I began to write The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And it was really important for me to tell this story in narrative form, to give voice to the children that I have been representing. So this is not an academic text, it's not a legal text, but it has all of the research and the law and the data woven together with the narrative in what I hope is plain language that's accessible to all of us, whether we're lawyers or whether we are civilians who are practicing in other jurisdictions, or neighbors or teachers, whomever, and even for young people. So I indeed opened the book with a powerful story about a child I represented, and I call him Eric for purposes of the book. Now, Eric was a 13-year-old Black boy that I represented right here in Washington, D.C. And one Saturday night, Eric was watching a movie in which someone had a Molotov cocktail. And in his 13-year-old brain, he thought it would be interesting to make something that looked like that. He didn't research it. He didn't ask anybody how to make it, but he went into his kitchen and he grabbed a glass bottle and he began to pour in whatever liquids he can find, pine sol, bleach, water, whatever he could find. And he taped the bottle up so that it would look like a Molotov cocktail. My favorite part of the story, though, is that he took a piece of toilet paper and ran the toilet paper from the inside of the bottle to the out and closed up the cap. So the toilet paper was supposed to be his wick. But of course, all of us listening know that that toilet paper would have burned out long before it ever reached the cap. So he played with it for a bit. And then it's a Saturday night. He didn't want it to spill out on his mother's white carpet. And so he shoved it in his book bag and forgot all about it, just like a 13-year-old would do. Monday morning comes and his mother drives him to school and he grabs his book bag, walks into the school and puts his book bag on a metal detector or a conveyor belt. And a school resource officer sees the bottle inside of his book bag and says, "What is this?" To which he immediately responds, "Oh, that is nothing. You can throw that away." Eric goes on to class. He doesn't think anything else of it. And lo and behold, this is the beginning of a 9-month ordeal in his local juvenile court. He gets arrested. He gets dragged out of school in front of his classmates. He tells the school resource officer, literally, "I was not trying to blow up the school. I did not even remember that it was in the bag." No one gave him the benefit of the doubt. He gets held in detention overnight and he gets prosecuted for attempted arson and possession of a Molotov cocktail. And if that isn't disturbing enough in and of itself, sometime later, I am giving a talk in Connecticut. And I share this story as a part of my talk. And a woman comes up to me, a white mother comes up to me, and she says, "My son did the exact same thing. And I said, what happened to him? And she said that her son was placed in advanced science classes, right? What an extraordinary contrast between the way Eric was treated and the way this young white male from Connecticut was treated. And so what we see, and for me, it just really became a real wake-up call and a resounding statement about the ways in which we criminalize normal, creative, adolescent activity among Black children, but yet we reward white children for being thoughtful, creative, and smart. So whenever I talk about the criminalization, or more specifically, the arrest, prosecution, and incarceration of Black children, most people assume that I must be talking about serious violent offenses. But the data shows that this is far from true. Very few young people of any race and class are engaged in the types of violent crimes that we are most afraid of, rape, murder, violent assaults, robberies or real robberies. And instead, juvenile courts across the country are disproportionately populated by children, and especially children of color like Eric, who have engaged in some adolescent behavior, right? Some behavior that reflects what children do. What do we know about teenagers? They're impulsive, reactive, they're emotional, they're fairness fanatics, they're sensation seekers, they're risk takers. They care about the immediate rewards and creativity of a moment and don't think ahead to the long-term consequences. And what do we know the most about kids? They care about what their friends think and what their friends do. So peer influence is not a myth, it's empirically demonstrated. But what is really important about the conversation we're having tonight about the intersection of race and adolescence is that research makes it clear that teenagers act like teenagers wherever they live and whatever they look like. So there's no sort of good adolescence and bad adolescence. There's no Black adolescence and white adolescence. Adolescence is just adolescence, right? And self-report data from across the country shows that teenagers admit to or acknowledge engaging in sort of delinquent behaviors. In fact, research shows that there is a temporary uptick in what we call criminality or delinquency in our teenage years, experimenting with drugs and sex and things of that nature that many of us did when we were teenagers. Yet, notwithstanding the developmental research that shows that children of all races and classes engage in the same key features of adolescence, we see that racial disparities are evident all across the United States. And even as arrest rates and referrals to juvenile court have gone down over the trajectory of the last 40 years, we see that racial disparities have grown over those that same time period. So just to give you a quick snapshot, in 2018, Black children accounted for only 15% of youth in our country, yet they made up approximately 35% of all children who were arrested. They accounted for 39% of all cases in which a child was formally processed in a juvenile court in that year. They accounted for 40% of all cases in which a child was sent to a detention facility to await their trial or sentencing. And they accounted for 51% of all children whom a judge decided to transfer from juvenile court up to adult criminal court to be tried and prosecuted as if they were indeed an adult. And particularly when we're talking about children in juvenile courts, we see that young people, young children of color are being sent to court for, again, those normal adolescent teenage behavior, including the talking back to adults, playing on a cell phone in class, going to parties, coming home after curfew, playing their music too loudly in the park, the clothing that they wear. And again, experimenting with drugs and sex in the ways that we have talked about earlier. Now, when children of color do commit serious crimes, right, to be distinguished from those normal adolescent behaviors that, quite frankly, don't really need law enforcement intervention, but sometimes children do commit serious crimes, we treat those children of color as if they are beyond redemption. We are more likely to prosecute them as an adult, more likely to impose severe sentences in adult court, like life without the possibility of parole. And this is really, really important. And I want to just draw our attention to some of the hard conversations we have to have in this country. So it's worth looking at the ways in which our country responded to Kyle Rittenhouse. And if we recognize and apply what I've just talked about with adolescent development, truly, Kyle Rittenhouse's behavior, if you all remember from Wisconsin, was the absolute epitome of adolescent behavior. He's a 17-year-old child who crosses the state lines with an assault rifle strapped across his body in plain sight. And why does he go? He goes across state lines because in his 17-year-old mind, he believes that somehow he is competent enough to go and protect these businesses that might be in need. He's got this very limited experience with the weapon. He's got this hunting license that he just secured, and that was not meant to be used in the ways in which he's carrying his gun out in public. And again, why does he go? He goes because he's impulsive, he's reactive, he's following the sensation of his friends. His friends, it's the peer influence. His friends invite him over. They even purchase the gun for him because he can't afford it, right? So he does what an adolescent does, right? He's making a really bad decision without strategic thinking, without thinking ahead to the long-term consequences. And then what happens? He ends up taking the lives of two people and severely injuring another. And what does he want? He, his mother, and his defense counsel, rightfully so, want the world to see him as an adolescent who just got in over his head. And indeed, so many of the public opinion accepted it. Not only does he get a fair trial, he gets due process, right? Contrast that to Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old Black child who was playing with a toy gun in Cleveland, Ohio, and he gets shot in less than 3 seconds of the officer's arrival on the scene. But yet Kyle Rittenhouse literally is perceived, he gets a fair trial and is perceived as an adolescent, indeed, who got in over his head and is found not guilty of self-defense. The reason why I wanted to sit on that story is to really help drive home how incredibly differently we believe or we perceive African-American children. So think about a Black child who has a gun and who gets labeled what? As a gang member for being called to meet up with his friends, right? And things go awry. He's inexperienced, this Black child, inexperienced with a gun, and things go awry and someone gets hurt. And we want to throw the book at him. We want to throw him under the jail. We can't imagine that this could be a similar situation in which a Black child acquires a gun through a friend, makes really poor decisions and gets and is forced to or finds himself in over his head and acting out of self-defense. So I think that's a really, really important contrast, even when we're talking about serious violent offenses. Now, we cannot talk about the criminalization, and I also talk about the dehumanization of Black and brown children without understanding what police encounters with Black children look like, and how those encounters affect the health and well-being of young people, especially Black and brown children. Again, I think the best way to help us understand how Black and Latino children in particular experience policing is to share with you a story, another story of a child that I represented and how he was impacted. So I want to tell you a story about Andre. I call him Andre in the book. He's a 15-year-old boy, again, African-American, who's walking down the street with a friend that I call James. There's absolutely no report of crime. The boys aren't doing anything out of the ordinary. They're not laughing. They're not using drugs. They're not roughhousing. They're just walking down the street. Police officers drive up next to them in a car, they roll down their window and they ask the boys, have you heard any gunshots? To which both boys say no, and they keep on walking. The officers are still not satisfied. They follow the boys and say, hey, can you show me your waistband? Both boys lift up the shirts, and what the police officers are trying to see is if the boys have any weapons that are visible around their waistband area. The boys show their waistband, the officers don't see anything, the boys keep walking. The officers are still not satisfied. And the officers then say to them, can I frisk you? Can I search you? At which point one or both of the boys says yes. 4 officers get out of their car and begin to pat down the boys. And I have to tell you, as a defense attorney who's been representing children for quite some time, I am always baffled when anybody, adult or child, says, yes, feel free to search me, to the police officers when there's no apparent basis for that search. And so we asked Andre, so why in the world did you say yes to searching them? And Andre's answer says it all. He said, if we had said no, they were going to frisk us anyway. And if we tried to run away, they would have shot us in the back. And it's such a profound statement. And I give this, I have this conversation with officers. This isn't, it doesn't matter whether the officers indeed ever would have shot these kids, right? It's the perception. It's the perception of how these children experience that moment. And there are now generations of Black children and Latino children who have grown up under the constant sort of surveillance of police officers in certain pockets of our country. In certain Black and brown neighborhoods, police officers are parked on the street corner. They drive through the community at all hours of the day and night, asking young people where they're going, where they're coming from, and the consequences are devastating. Most of us probably listening in this Zoom right now, probably take it for granted that they can walk about their neighborhood without any undue sort of intrusion or questioning by the police. But that is not the reality for so many Black and brown children. And when I say the effects are significant, I mean that there is a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that policing imposes on young people at one of the most important times in their lives, their adolescent years. Studies show that Black children who have been the target of excessive stops and frisks by the police report high rates of anxiety, distress, depression, hopelessness. They really become hypervigilant, meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. And what's really disturbing is that distrust of police officers often transfers over to other state actors, right? Like teachers and counselors, other people who might be allies. And what is so powerful about the research is that it shows that trauma occurs not only from being the direct target of some police aggression, but also from witnessing or hearing about that aggression from family or friends or someone who's close to them. So just having to worry about getting up in the morning and becoming coming into contact with police is in and of itself a source of stress for many young Black children. Even watching police brutality on the internet or television involving people that we don't even know is, again, just as traumatic as being there. So researchers have found a significant association between what they call traumatic events online, such as the killing of George Floyd, right? And post-traumatic stress disorder and other types of depressive symptoms. So I often ask people to think about where you were, how you felt when you watched the footage of George Floyd being killed on television and how traumatic that was for you. And then think about what it might be like to be a Black or a brown child who recognizes or who thinks that this could be me next. Right. And so again, when I say to police officers, this isn't an anti-police conversation, right? It is a recognition that the blue uniform carries with it some significant racial tension throughout American history, and that these high-profile examples have a profound impact on young people. And so that when an officer meets a child, even when the officer is there for a wellness check, or the officer means well and wants to help the child, that they have to approach the child with the understanding that all of that history comes into those encounters. Now, research also shows that young people who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods or who attend heavily surveilled schools or who are the target of significant stops and frisks and encounters with the police, also report a significantly greater odds of sleep deprivation altogether, insomnia, or really poor sleep quality. And so for any of you who have children, you know that poor sleep affects teenagers' ability to focus in school the next day. It affects their emotions and attitudes. It affects their ability to engage with adults calmly and respectfully throughout the day. And in one of the most important ways in which policing impacts adolescence is in adolescent identity development, which is one of the most important things that happens during our teenage years. And frequent police interventions affect a child's self-esteem, causing them at times to question who they are, who they can become, and how they fit into the rest of society. The same research also shows that negative experiences with the police affect an adolescent's perceptions about the fairness and the legitimacy of policing as an institution. And that is because adolescence is a time when our initial impressions of law and law enforcement and of justice really become fixed in our minds. And so early negative encounters have a detrimental impact on how young people begin to decide whether or not it's even worth it to participate in mainstream society. There's been some research showing that as a result of our over-policing at times, right? Intervening in the lives of children for normal adolescent behaviors, right? That we don't need traditional law enforcement interventions, that actually increases crime instead of reducing crime. And so in the final trauma study I want to share with you is research showing something that I think we know intuitively, is that extended periods of psychological trauma and chronic stress lead to poor physical health outcomes in the long term. So high blood pressure, diabetes, stroke, heart attacks, autoimmune disorders have all been associated with these types of chronic stress, including the chronic stress associated with living in a heavily surveilled or significantly policed neighborhood. Now, before I move on from policing, I want to just say a word about policing in schools. I will say to you that for the longest time, I accepted the often repeated narrative that we have police in schools today because teachers and parents were afraid to send their children to school after the mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado in 1999. But as I did research for this book, I realized that the first police officers appeared in schools in Indianapolis in 1939 at the earliest conversation about even the possibility of integrating schools, racially integrating schools. And then police presence increased exponentially in the civil rights era under the guise of creating a safe passage for Black and brown children who would integrate those schools. But we know from the historical record and from the iconic photographs that too often policing became an impediment to full and meaningful integration of schools. Now, fast forward to 1991, we're still 8 years before Columbine, and we have the National Association of School Resource Officers is founded. That means there are enough school police officers across the country to have national conferences, national training curriculum, national mission statement. Again, 8 years before Columbine. Fast forward to 1994, 6 years before Columbine, and we have the federal framework. The federal government creates the Cops in Schools framework, which is the vehicle through which the federal government will funnel money into states and local school systems that will hire police officers. All right. What is happening in the mid-1990s? That is the heart of the super predator era. That is the myth put forth by Princeton professor John DiIulio, who predicted by the year 2000, Black children would run amok and rape, maim, and kill much of America. Well, we know that this myth turned out to be absolutely untrue. And John DiIulio himself shortly thereafter recanted that myth. But the damage was already done. Laws across the country were changed to make it easier to prosecute children as adults. And let's be clear, the super predator myth was explicitly identified and targeting Black children. And one of the outcomes of that super predator myth was this increase in school resource officers. So indeed, in 1999, when Columbine, the tragedy in Columbine occurred, the federal government did increase funding for school police officers, but where did those officers get sent? They got sent to schools with a disproportionately Black and brown student population. And so now all 50 states have police officers in school systems, and unfortunately, more police in schools means more arrest in schools. More arrest in schools means more arrest of Black and brown students. And in fact, the data shows that Black girls are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested at their school than white girls. Black boys are 2.4 times more likely to be arrested at school than white boys, right? So we have to think about the people assume that policing makes us safer in schools, but we've already talked about the cost, the traumatic effects, the impact on school climate, and the research showed that police presence in schools actually doesn't increase school safety in the ways in which we have long believed. So the question that we next have to ask is, how did we get here? Why is it that the officers responded to Eric and to Andre the way that they did? And a significant part of that answer involves the ways in which racial bias shapes our perceptions of and response to Black children. So we've already talked about Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old who was shot and killed in Cleveland. But do people remember what the police officer said when they were interviewed after that shooting? They, of course, talked about how how they received a 911 call for a Black male with a gun in the park. What most people do not realize is that the 911 caller also said that the gun was probably fake and that the person with the gun was probably a child. There is some debate about whether that information was passed on to the officers, but research shows that it doesn't matter whether or not the officers had heard that information or not, because they raced onto the scene and within 3 seconds, they observe a Black male. And the research shows that Tamir Rice, this is what the officer said. Let me go back to his photograph. The officer said over and over again that he looked older than he actually was. The officer said he looked like he was wearing he was wearing a size 36 pant, an extra large jacket. They said he looked like he was 170 pounds, standing 5 feet 7 inches tall. And so I wanted to come back to this picture because somehow in those 3 seconds, they could not stop slow enough to see this 12-year-old baby face. But the research shows that Tamir Rice is not alone. There has been a really important body of research put out by Dr. Philip Atiba Goff demonstrating that both police officers and civilians are more likely to believe that Black children are older than they actually are. And they're more likely to perceive Black children, Black boys in particular, to be more than 4.5 years older than they actually are. That is profound. So a child like Tamir Rice appears to be, 16 or 17-year-old, and a 16-year-old child or a 17-year-old child appears to be an adult, 20, 21 years old. That is a function of our implicit racial biases about Black children. Similar research has been done with Black girls, finding that adults tend to view Black girls as older, less innocent, more mature, more knowledgeable about adult-like topics, more independent, and less in need of protection than white girls. More generally, several studies have found that individuals, like all of us on the Zoom, are more likely to interpret ambiguous behaviors and ambiguous facial expressions by Black youth and Black Americans as more aggressive and more consistent with violent intentions, while interpreting those same behavior by white children as harmless. So just to drive home the point, I want you to look up at your screen and I want to ask you, does this child appear to be sad or angry? Does this child, I like that Joanna's like, right? Does this child appear to be sad or angry? Well, regardless, right, of what you and I think while we're in the midst of a conversation explicitly about implicit bias, the research shows that adults are more likely to inaccurately perceive anger on Black children's faces, and that these misperceptions of anger help explain why Black students receive more frequent and harsher discipline in school than non-Black students. Let's look at some more photographs. Now, I want you to tell me whether or not this person, this male, can bench press more weights. Can he lift more weights than this person? This person or this person? And again, regardless of what we think in a workshop or a conversation like this, the research shows that people like you and me and like officers tend to perceive young Black males as bigger, taller, heavier, more muscular, and more physically threatening, meaning stronger and more capable of harm than young white males. That racial bias persists even when the two people appear, or the two people have the exact same height, weight, and upper body strength as one another, that we perceive the Black male as older, as stronger, and more threatening. So the last set of photographs here, look at these kids. Do these kids appear dangerous? Do these kids appear dangerous? do these kids appear dangerous, right? And so we actually have to ask ourselves, we have to be honest with ourselves. When we walk through a park, are we likely to see a group of Black children and think that they are dangerous? Well, the research yet again shows that Black children in a group are more likely to be stopped, frisked, searched, arrested, and experience some sort of police force than white children. And here, or white youth, or white adults even. And here's what's significant is that the research shows that police officers are no more likely to find criminal contraband on a group of Black children that have been stopped than on a group of white children. So that means we're not doing it with any accuracy, right? We're not solving any more crime. We're not increasing public safety by these types of stops. So this is a lot of information. And so the question becomes, how do we use this information to drive change? And so I like to talk about 4 themes for reform. One theme is that we have to radically reduce the footprint of law enforcement or traditional law enforcement in the lives of all children, and especially Black and brown children who have been disproportionately targeted. We also need to invest in alternatives to traditional strategies for public safety. I'll say more. And we want to ensure in those rare circumstances, right? When we do need police officers to engage with youth, that's a really much smaller number than the contact that we have now. But in those rare circumstances, we need to ensure that police contact is developmentally appropriate. And when we do have children who engage in serious offenses, again, to be distinguished from those kids who commit or who engage in normal adolescent activities that don't belong in court at all. But when we have kids who engage in serious adolescent, delinquent, or criminal behavior, we need to insist upon developmentally appropriate responses to all youth, not just to the Cal Rittenhouses of the world, not just to other, wealthy white youth who have access to, opportunity and lawyers and publicity. It's really, really important. So the bottom line is we have to invest directly in children, in families, and in communities instead of in buildings and in traditional law enforcement responses. And we have to reimagine school and community safety using a public health approach. And a public health approach is attentive to the relationship between children and adults. It is an approach that is racially equitable. It is an approach that is restorative, that seeks to restore relationships that have been breached, and that is trauma responsive. So what does that look like on the ground? It means that we need a continuum of mental health providers and mental health services that are available to young people. We need counselors and social workers and peer intervention specialists. We need vocational counselors. We need positive youth interventions. And we need social emotional learning within the academic curriculum. And we need restorative justice frameworks. When I talk about what does developmentally appropriate policing look like in those rare circumstances when we need police involvement, it requires training on adolescent development, adolescent brain structures, and adolescent psychosocial features of adolescence. It means that officers need to be trained on de-escalation strategies. What would a good parent do? What would a good teacher do? What would a good social worker do when a child, excuse me, is engaged in these types of adolescent behaviors? Excuse me. We also need to regulate and prohibit use of force on young people. And that includes the use of handcuffing on young children, 12 years age and younger. And so we need certain protections that would prevent a young child from being asked to consent to a search of his or her body, because no child of any race or any class really has the wherewithal and the experience to know that they are free to walk away from the police. Even adults are intimidated by law enforcement and tend to, waive their rights without even understanding, but even more so children, and think how much more so a Black child who lives in a society where they are naturally afraid of what a police encounter might look like. And then finally, when I talk about developmentally appropriate responses to adolescent serious offending, I don't know why I'm choking right at the end here, but in a moment I will grab some water. But we're talking about evidence-based best practices for engaging young people. And we call it multi-systemic therapy, family functional therapy. So I'm going to have to stop for a moment. And the bottom line is that we have to learn to treat all Black children like children. So fortunately, that is my last slide. And I hope that some of you will consider reading more about the stories of the young people and reading more about this research in the Rage of Innocence. So what I'm going to do is, if you will allow me to grab some water really quickly, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and that will give our team here an opportunity to prepare for questions. So if you'll indulge me for 1 second, I apologize. I should have had my water right next to me. 1 second. All right. Oops. I am back and I am safe. That has never happened to me right at the end there. So I see that that we have gotten some questions, so I will let you all filter and let's get started.
Sig, are you going to? Sig, are you in charge?
No,
Unmute.
I'm abdicating to you, Joanna and to Mary.
Looking at things, trying to figure
Although I do have a question which I put into the chat because I couldn't get it into the Q&A. You see the question there? I addressed it to Professor Henning.
I can see the question as well.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can't see Sig's.
No,
So it may have been directly to you, Professor.
I think that's right. So Sig, let's talk about it. So what Sig asks, is there a difference between the arrest of children from affluent Black families and less well-off Black families? In other words, does family wealth play any role in the arrest rates of Black adolescents? And so this is what I say in response to that question. It is that wealth does not protect Black children from the inevitable encounters with racial bias in our country. And that when we walk through society and we see a Black child as older, as more mature, as physically more threatening, that applies to all children. And one isn't rarely able to look at a Black child and differentiate in those ways. So that's one thing. But what I do say is this, that wealth does, I don't want to act like wealth doesn't have any impact, right? I think in the main, there's no real protection. But what it helps with is after the point of arrest. There are times when an African-American family with some clout or some class, some financial resources may be able, but not always, right? May be able to engage with some of the key stakeholders in the system to make a difference in the outcome. But I really don't want to overstate that point, right? Because racial bias persists at all stages of the system. The reason, though, I do, and I make this point in the book, is that poverty really makes it worse. And that's probably the way I should have stated, that racial bias exists, but poverty makes it worse. How so? Poverty makes it worse because of some of the collateral consequences that are at play. So I have represented children who live in public housing, for example, and that a criminal prosecution can result in the eviction of entire families from that public housing because of a child's arrest. And so poverty makes it worse.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Have you found any difference in how Black policemen versus white policemen treat the youth? Some of the photos were showing. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And that's another question that I get, that it's a really important question. And several things. One, again, is that the implicit racial bias is so pervasive that in our country that it impacts people even of the same race. All right. And so it's important to remember that. That said, racial diversity on police forces is important. But you know what's more important is training is more important, right? So getting police officers on a police force that are racially diverse really increases the likelihood that a Black officer will have children themselves and be able to see themselves in Black children that they encounter, and that they can share those stories and share those narratives with other police officers. That said, the data shows that diversifying the police force has not been enough to stop what we see in racially disparate arrests, racial bias, the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. So something more has to happen. One, officers have to be educated on their racial biases, on adolescent development, all of the things that I talked about earlier, learning de-escalation techniques. And so we've got to have more than just diversification, but it does matter. It really does matter.
Yes.
Karen Brannon asks, with so much evidence against more police, why does DC leadership continue to go with more police? What would you do if you were mayor?
Oh, wow. What a beautiful, beautiful question. Is the mayor listening? No. So here's the deal, right? This happens all over the country, not just in Washington, DC. We have the politically expedient knee-jerk response instead of following the research. So fear is one of the driving political motivators, and fear of crime is significant, right? And so when your constituents say to you, I'm afraid, what's the quickest response? Add more police to the police force, send more police to the neighborhood. And I gotta say, many civilians think that that's the answer. But why do your constituents want more police? Because we have not taught them anything else, right? We have not taught them about the alternatives, the public health approach to public safety. The other thing that has to happen is that we have to, and you asked, what would I have the mayor do, is, and we've pitched this to the police commission. Several years ago, I've had an opportunity to speak about a public health approach. And I'm not the first one to talk about this, but it requires a patient and methodical and a courageous shifting of resources from our traditional knee-jerk law enforcement, send more police out there. It requires a shift into a reallocation of resources, right? And I don't expect everybody to wake up overnight and decide, I'm going to defund the police. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's an important but significant and intentional shift of resources to these public health strategies. And what's really, really critical, and particularly at a moment like this, is that we have to stay the course with the evidence-based best practices. And so when we have a temporary uptick in carjackings, we have a high-profile, tragic, violent death that breaks my heart, it doesn't mean we abandon the efforts and jump immediately back into law enforcement responses. And that's what's happening. That's what's happening. We don't put enough money in, and we don't stay the course and allow for trial and error. So that's what I would recommend.
Jeremiah Mungo asks, should there be some government funding for therapy when the police traumatize some youth, particularly Black youth, from their practices?
Oh, wow. That's a wonderful suggestion, creative thinking. My thinking is we need look, so the answer is yes, absolutely. That should be a part of, and you'll see sometimes when there's civil suits after a tragic death, you'll see the family asking for compensation that includes trauma and therapy. But I hear the question to also say, trauma and therapy in schools, because so many young people were traumatized from watching it, or focus groups, youth groups that allow young people to come together and talk about what these moments mean, right? In our city when they happen, or even when they happen in Baltimore, or they happen on the national news, creating space. So my position is that we need to build that into the budget. The research shows that 72% of all children, this is an amazing statistic, 72% of all children today have experienced some or at least one significant traumatic event in their lives. But by the time they reach the age of 18, 1 in 10 students in school will have such severe mental health needs that it requires some professional intervention. That children today are experiencing record levels of trauma, anxiety, and depression. Given that stat alone, separate and apart from policing, we need more services in the system for kids, or in the school system and the community for kids to deal with this trauma and mental health. And on top of that, people have to understand that racial trauma, and which includes some of the traumatic experiences with policing, has to be a part of how we define trauma in our country.
Could you share how DC compares to comparable cities in the treatment of young Black people, especially in recent years, where MPD has been pressured to improve their policing?
Oh, it's a great question as well. I will say, look, I know I've struggled to come up with words to justify or explain how, as Sig and I started at the top of this conversation, that I can be practicing in a jurisdiction for 26 years and only have represented 4 white children. And let me be clear that I am not the only one to say this. I went to Gaithersburg, Maryland, and I was doing a talk, and someone from DC just happened to raise their hand in the audience and said the exact same thing. I hadn't even said it yet. And she said, I never see a white kid. If you go to the courthouse, if you go to the police station, you never see white children in DC courts. That is an extreme absurdity. I don't want, so DC is off the charts with that. It is absolutely off the charts with that. We just do not, respond to white children who are engaged. And let me be clear, you think about, all of the schools, Georgetown Day, Sidwell Friends. You cannot tell me, we actually know for a variety of reasons that children are experimenting, with drugs and many of the same things that Black children in our city are. It may look slightly different, but it's just not. So I'm getting a little, I get passionate about this. DC is an anomaly in that way. That said, racial disparities, the raw numbers are different in DC, but racial disparities, like I said, exist everywhere. The proportions exist everywhere. In terms of the question about DC has been making efforts, I do think DC has been making efforts. You see less arrests of children across the board. You see, I've had an opportunity to work with some of the school resource officers and the youth division captains, and they philosophically are on point and trying their best to make shifts. I will say to you though, it is hard to make shifts if we don't have leadership who's going to allocate money to these alternatives, like, whether it be credible messengers, violence interrupters, social emotional learning, all of those things. The mayor did put in money towards more mental health services in school systems, but we need even more. And that means you've got to increase mental health services and simultaneously begin to reduce our reliance on traditional law enforcement. So they're doing some changes. I am working with MPD now to work on what we call a race adolescent equity model, an adolescent race equity training module for the police department. And so I know the chief has talked about that publicly. So there's some changes. I will also say the final thing on this I'll say is also that Carl Racine, our Attorney General for the District of Columbia, has made radical shifts in what gets prosecuted. and so that you see, although you're still getting, all Black children pretty much in courts are being, arrested and sent to court, he has radically shifted the philosophy of making sure we're only, prosecuting those serious offenses and figuring out diversion alternatives and restorative justice alternatives for kids who don't belong in the system.
Do you have time for one more question? Thank you so much. Let's see, is there any screening tool available that can accurately assess or predict racial bias and or inability to manage a personal reaction based on that bias? And is this in use in police departments for hiring practices?
Oh, how incredibly fascinating. Wow. So here's the deal. There are instruments, but they're not meant to be used like as an individual, screening tool. So what it is the implicit association test, the IAT, which you can Google. You can put in implicit association test, and you can put in Harvard University. That's where you find it. You can actually take one yourself. And the implicit association test has, you can use them to test your bias around gender, around LGBTQ status, around race, and some other things. And you will see in my book that I talk about these empirical studies on implicit racial bias. They use the IAT as a way, as an empirical measure for study subjects. Like, 20 of us on the Zoom could be in a study subject, and we would be administered the implicit association test and figure out whether we have implicit racial bias and to what degrees, but it's not meant to be so geared towards a screening instrument for hiring practices. Let me be clear, with everyone on the Zoom, we all have implicit racial bias. Okay, we all, even within the same race, and especially as it relates to this intersection between Blackness and supposed criminality. All right, it is been passed down from time immemorial in our country. First, it started as an intentional and explicit narratives that were meant, to be quite frank, to dehumanize Black and brown people so that they could be exploited in the era of slavery, in the era of the Jim Crow, in the era of the 1990s. Those were all explicit and intentional narratives that were false and inaccurate. But they live on in the American psyche. And as a result, we all have these racial biases. And so I just say that to you, it's a great idea. What we need is that everyone who gets hired by the police department across the country needs to take an implicit bias so they can attest, so they can understand that they have their own implicit biases. And then they need to have training and conversations around it. And so we're not going to probably weed people out through that test, though I love it. I love the idea, but I don't think it works. None of us would have jobs.
So on behalf of the Hill Havara and Joanna, on behalf of Capitol Hill Village, speaking for you, cannot thank you enough, Professor Henning, for this absolutely terrific presentation, enlightening. You hit so many key points. that you highlight in the book as well. It was educational, inspiring, and certainly something that we have to think long and hard about. Joanna?
Thank you for
Second
having me,
that.
Sig. I really appreciate it, really. Sorry,
Great.
Joanna.
Okay. We
Thank
could
you very
use
much.
another
Mary, thank
hour
you
of
for-
conversation and questions, but thank you very much.
Great.
All right.
Yes, and I will drop a link into for the book. I know a couple of folks are expressed an
there.
interest in reading. So let me
Yes,
see.
yes.
Yes, there it is. The Rage of
Yes.
Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And it can be purchased anywhere, quite frank, that books are sold. If you're an
Good.
online person, of course, Amazon. So.
Yeah.
Thank you again. And
Thank
thank
you.
you, everybody.